Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Fantastic. This week we're going to take on a big topic. Every plane has one. Every pilot should know how to use it. And we are going to talk about POHs. Getting to know your POH, understanding your POH, and figuring out how to make it something that you get to use on a regular basis that is valuable for you. Wally, what do you think about on a check ride when the student walks in, sits down, or the applicant sits there and they don't have a POH with them? They didn't bring the POH. Is that a good start?
It's probably not a good start, no. And, they, at least with me, they get an email letter of telling them what they need to bring, and included in that is the POH. I just remember my first flight happened on August 31st, 1981. My first instructional flight. I'd flown with my father previous to that, but 40 years ago, and it was I was flying in Monroe, Louisiana, and I was flying a Tomahawk, a PA-38-112 was the designation. And I remember my first flight. We flew, I want to say 7/10 of an hour. And we came back in, and I remember my instructor telling me I needed to buy a couple of things. And the first thing I needed to buy was a logbook. Second thing was the POH for the Piper Tomahawk. And to this day, I still have that POH at home, 40 years old. And I remember him telling me, you need to know this cover to cover. You need to know everything in this book. And I went home and I started reading, and I remembered that it had a 78-inch propeller, and all the intricacies of the engine. I didn't understand what a lot of it meant, but I understood that it was a Lycoming engine and the designation. I've since forgot most of it, but I do remember sitting down and reading the POH, and over years, I think it's safe to say that any airplane I have taken a check ride in, I have owned a copy of the POH. We're in a digital world where people can download things to their digital device, so it's maybe easier nowadays to have that. But I always felt like if I was going to go take a check ride, boy, I really needed to know that airplane, and I wanted my copy of the POH. I still, in my bookcase at home, I've got a POH for a Beechcraft Duchess, a Bonanza, a Baron. I've still got them all, and they're all very old. The pages are still white, which is good, but I think maybe we've gotten away from that a little bit. And, I tell people, I tell students when I'm working with them that it's not so much that you need to know the POH, but you need to know what's in there, and you need to know how to use it. In other words, if you're going to study a section of the POH, studying the table of contents to know what checklists you have available, what abnormal and or emergency checklist you have available. In other words, do we in a Cessna or Piper, whatever, it doesn't matter, do we have a checklist that's entitled alternator failure? We probably don't. We probably have a low voltage checklist. If we're in a situation where we're talking about an alternator failure, the applicant may they're looking for a checklist called alternator failure, and they're not going to find that. So you need to know really what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've owned a lot of POHs. I don't know that I've owned every one of them for every plane that I've ever been in or had, but I definitely know that I bought the POH for an N model when I started my training, because my flight instructor said the same thing. I think in the digital age, we're getting to where people are downloading PDFs and things off the internet, and it's a slippery slope because those PDFs don't necessarily match the plane you're flying in. I'm holding that POH that I had from a long time ago in my hand right now, and it says that it's for serial numbers 10468, 10507, 0640, 0656, and on, right? So if you have one before this, you're not getting the right information. Is it going to be drastically different? I don't know. I would think the airspeeds might be the same, but you would think the electrical system would probably be different. If they had gear, the gear system might be different. And you don't want to just be picking a Cessna POH because there's a lot of 172s out there with a lot of differences in them. And I don't think you'd want to take a chance on that. And I'm a Cessna pilot center at this flight school, and every time I meet with my Cessna reps, I tell them your POHs should be cheaper because I'm afraid that the price is a hindrance to students going and buying them now when flight training is expensive. So we are a Cessna pilot center here, and one of the recommendations I always make to my Cessna team when they're here meeting with us is they need to find a way to make POHs cheaper, or they need to find a way to make the digital copies for specific serial numbers available to students at a much cheaper price. Make them expire or something. Do something to where students can have real access to them. Now, I'm still a huge fan of paper. I'm a digital guy. I've got an iPad, an iPhone, and a MacBook on my desk. But I still like to have this paper POH because the sections, and we're going to talk about those, are easy to jump through as a potential flight instructor candidate. I've got my POHs all tabbed out and all the stuff that I want to turn to quickly to teach from ready to go. But even if I am studying it or looking at it, it's much easier to turn and flip section to section, see the images. Man, when you scroll through a PDF and you got to scroll back, it's really hard to find exactly where you were at in that PDF.
Right.
Especially if it's not searchable by text, it's just images. It makes it very, very difficult, to say the least. So some really old POHs aren't the same anymore, but somewhere, and I'll try to look it up at some point during the show, somewhere in the mid-'80s, the POH sections all became standardized across brands and types and all that. Most of us probably have heard of that, but we may not know what those sections are. And I like to talk about really kind of the front of the book. The front of the book's got some really good information in it.
Yeah.
Then we have a general section, limitations, emergency procedures, normal procedures, performance, and then weight and balance. From there, I think there's we don't look too much past that in our POHs on a regular basis, but we should. Beyond that, we have the systems, airplane and systems descriptions, handling services and maintenance, and then supplements. And the supplements would be your navigational equipment if you have different items in there or other things. But I think we spend the majority of our flight training days in those first 6 sections, maybe even probably the first 5 sections. And one of the things you pointed out to me before we started recording was that the procedures, normal procedures section and the performance section follows what process there, Wally? What do we see in that?
Yeah, if you look in the performance section of a POH, it follows the order of a flight. So if you're looking for landing distance, it's going to be towards the back of it. If you're looking for takeoff distance, towards the front. Cruise performance numbers are going to be in the middle. So, you see a lot of people, a lot of times a takeoff distance chart looks a lot like a landing distance chart. Well, and of course, it says it on the top. So if you just read it and pay attention to it, you should be okay. But the other side of that is if you're looking, what is my required landing distance? It's going to be towards the back section of the performance section.
Now, I have never read an owner's manual in one of my vehicles, but I have read POHs before. And the big difference is you're flying something in a 3-dimensional space where you don't necessarily have the opportunity to just pull over and then search for what you're looking for. You really need to understand things, and we're fans of different things, but we believe in similar things. Of course, fuel is Wally's biggest one, right? Fuel, and fuel. But the fact that you can turn to the front and see how many gallons are in the plane is a really good reference. But there's a whole bunch of fuel stuff in the back, and you might find fuel stuff scattered throughout, right? How many gallons does this plane should you account for, kind of as a rule of thumb, for taxi, run up, and taxi before takeoff? That's a pretty important number that you should know, and you can find all that information in your POH, of course.
Right.
What maybe we don't want to give away everything on your check rides, Wally, but where do you start thinking about the POH in your check ride when you have an applicant? Are you starting to ask questions about the POH?
Yeah, well, we were required to cover some systems in a check ride, and of course we adhere to that and cover those systems. But the way I don't just say, tell me about the so-and-so system. The way I do it is I put them in a scenario where we're in flight and this happened. You have this indication. What is, what are you going to do about it? Or how are you going to handle it? And through that, we end up talking about the associated system. And a lot of times the correct answer that I'm looking for is I'm going to pull out a checklist. And I say, okay, well, let's pull out the checklist, and let's pull out the checklist that's in the POH, and see what it says to do. And then we'll end up talking about the system through that. One thing I find that there are in the airlines we have certain checklists that are memory items. Sometimes we call them bold-faced, but we're required to know those things from memory. And, a rapid decompression might be an example of one, and it's probably going to be get the oxygen mask on and establish crew communications. And that would be maybe an example of a rapid decompression. Of course, we're not going to have a rapid decompression in our Cessnas or our Warriors, but one thing that we do have that might require us to really have something memorized, or at least the first few steps, is a fire. And we can talk about several different fires, and the first one that I usually like to talk about with students is a fire while starting the engine. So we're starting the engine and we look out and we see flames coming from the cowling. What are you going to do? And by and large, I've referenced this in many different manufacturers' POHs, but by and large, it's the same thing. To make a fire, you need three things. You need fuel. And when we say fuel, it doesn't necessarily have to be gasoline or avgas. I mean, wood is considered a fuel, but you got to have fuel, you got to have oxygen, and you got to have heat or a spark. So if we eliminate one of those three, we can eliminate the fire. So, by and large, most airplanes, when I ask people, what are you going to do for a fire during engine start? Most people will say, well, I'm going to pull the mixture and get out and run, or I'm going to get out and get the fire extinguisher and go try to put the fire out. And most of the in fact, I hate to say all, but I will say it. I think every reciprocating engine checklist that I've ever looked at for this scenario, fire during start, the procedure is to pull the mixture and keep cranking the engine, because you pull the mixture, you've eliminated the fuel, and by cranking, you can suck the flames into the engine and put the fire out. Obviously, if that doesn't work and the fire still goes on, you want to take care of yourself and get out of the airplane, and as much as I hate to say it, maybe let the airplane burn up, but you want to take care of yourself. So, but the fire checklists are something that you might not have time to actually reference the POH. Here we are a couple weeks past 9/11, and I don't know, most of you probably watched some TV specials on the events of 9/11 and the collapse of the Twin Towers. And, we all saw those images of those towers on fire. And at some point, the towers lost structural integrity and, because of the heat, because of the fire, and caused them to collapse. So we have the same situation in an airplane. If we have a wing fire or a fuselage fire, we've got to figure out how are we going to put this fire out. I mean, one school of thought is to put the nose down, get a lot of air moving over it, and try to blow the fire out. But the downside to that is, if you lost structural integrity, you may break a wing off or something like that. So that's why you're pilot in command. You got to make those decisions, and you probably don't have a whole lot of time to really decide what you want to do. So, reference your POH, and I preface that I would say that anything we say, you need to reference your pilot operating handbook, because it's specific for each airplane, and it's there for a reason.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you talked about memory items, and I don't know that I have put every one of these fire checklists in my memory, but I think reviewing them and preparing to talk about the POH and these checklists for the show, it has made me think about, really what am I going to do in each of these situations. And I think structurally the wing would be the biggest one that I would worry about, because the fuel tanks are out there. They're going to burn really hot. They're going to have a lot of fuel that I can't turn off out there. Where I might be able to turn off a fuel switch inside the aircraft. And that's where we're going to see structural damage. I don't know that I would naturally think to turn off the landing and taxi light if I had had a fire on one of my wings, but that sure does seem like the most logical spot that a fire would start, and might not be right on top of a fuel tank yet. The nav lights are on the next thing on the checklist, and you would think, again, more electrical stuff, more if I turn that circuit off, then I'm going to be able to break that. And then the next thing on the list is strobe lights, and the next thing is pitot heat. So it really would constitute that it's probably something electrical, and you would want all that electric to get turned off as soon as possible, so that whatever was starting or fueling the spark on that fire, that you were putting it out for sure, to save that wing for sure. What else in a POH, Wally? We talked about systems being more towards the back. I think as people have asked me questions around this flight school and have questions, it is kind of almost comical at times. We talk about how much all this is open book. No one's keeping a secret on how the flaps work. No one's keeping a secret on whether your aircraft or the aircraft you're going to fly has 30 degrees or 40 degrees of flaps. And albeit from the early 80s, many of these drawings are fantastic in these POHs, right? They have all the linkages and all the pulleys for the ailerons, how the ailerons work. I've heard horror stories of these cables being ran backwards. Hopefully that never happens ever again. But, if they did, that would be nearly impossible for any of us to fly, turning right to turn left, etc. But it gives you a really good visual of how those pulley systems work and where you would want to make sure those pulleys could continue to move. I'm just looking at page 7-8 in a basic Cessna 172S POH, and it shows all the cables for the trim tabs, the elevator, the ailerons, the rudder controls, all the way to the pedals, and it's kind of got the system that it's talking about highlighted. So if you haven't turned to the back of your POH to truly learn the systems and the way the systems work, you're missing the opportunity to really get smart about the aircraft you're flying and understand that you can learn a lot about how the linkages work and how that all works out.
Yeah, and something that's pretty simple is, do we have a 12 volt or a 24 volt electrical system? probably for most people, that's never going to come into play. But if you're out somewhere and you've got a dead battery and you need to go to the local FBO and get a jump start because you maybe left the master switch on the night before, that's some information they need to know.
Well, we've talked about recently having a show on some of our tips and tricks and best practices just about flying these GA aircraft, and that will be coming soon. But one of those we're going to talk about is, you said 12 and 24, and you're spot on, and I asked people, then why is it 14 and 28? And most people that I ask that question to, Wally, are just deer in headlights, right? If you look at a voltmeter or you plug in a reader of some sort into a cigarette lighter in a plane, it's going to say 14 or 28. At what time? When would it say 14 or 28 in a 12 volt or 24 volt system, Wally?
Well, that's telling you that the alternator is working.
So the engine's running at that point.
Right.
If that engine stops running, that same voltmeter is going to read 12 or 24.
Right.
And that's a really good thing for pilots to understand and know, because if you happen to have a volt indicator in your plane and you are used to seeing 28 volts, well, if it says 24, your battery is going to stop working at some point, because you now know the alternator quit working.
Right.
And so while it's not critical, man, if I get into an aircraft, I'm going to know before I start that engine the difference between those two numbers, so that I can throughout flight be watching it.
Yeah.
And if I'm flying something with a glass panel, that battery is probably a lot more important to me than not. I'm really going to know in a glass panel. And if you listen to our show the last couple of weeks, you heard us talk about every switch and every gauge, and we've got thousands of more switches and gauges to go over. But the back of your POH has every switch on your instrument panel depicted, and it has a number and says, this is the master switch, this is the avionics switch. And you would be lazy at best if you don't go back and look at those and understand what each of those switches are pointing to and what their function is as it relates to knowing what your aircraft's doing. What about what else would you say in the POHs of super value? Obviously the whole book is valuable to the customer, but there's a lot of conversion charts in your POH that could be valuable. I just took a newer, younger pilot up to fly, and it was getting chilly as we got higher, which is really nice in Houston, Texas. We were at about 6,500 feet, and the panel said 19 Celsius. Well, I'm not very good at that, but there was a conversion chart, and we learned that 19 Celsius was about 66 degrees.
Yeah.
And at 66 degrees in a hot Cessna, feels like you got air conditioning. Yeah. It's really nice up there at that height.
Yeah, I've actually gotten pretty good at converting. So, well, I won't say an easy conversion, but if you double it and take away 10% and add 32, you convert Celsius. So 19 double 38, take away 10%, it's about 4, so it's 34, and add 32, and you've got 66.
There you go. I will have to remember that trick. Another tip and trick that we'll throw out there. We also think we're going to share some good mental math stuff, but the math is calculated for you throughout the book in a lot of different places, and should help you understand your aircraft and what you're going to be flipping and turning on in that aircraft. Another great section is weight and balance.
Yeah.
And I think that too many people today use ForeFlight or have copied an aircraft in ForeFlight and changed some numbers, and they're very dependent on loads that maybe someone else has created or that they might not really understand. The rudimentary paper weight and balance may save your life one day, so I'll challenge everyone to go back and do one and make sure it matches what you say in ForeFlight. But your POH has a great sample question, meaning a sample load, gives you an idea. I was doing it for this young pilot the other day as we were going to go fly, and I probably don't think about that 1.1 gallons that I use every time for starting, taxiing, and run up. And it was a kind of an eye-opener again. Okay, there's 6.6 pounds I'm burning off that I need to be thinking about, because I'd like that if I need it to land for sure.
Right, and most of us who are in a flight training mode, most time we get in the airplane with two people, the instructor and yourself, And at some point you've done a weight and balance probably early on, and you know that it works. You've got plenty of extra room for payload, and you don't think about it a whole lot. But then when you go and you do put 3 people or maybe even 4 people in an airplane, it's something to be concerned about, and something that we should be doing every time.
We also hear this a lot around here, right? I'm not really worried about the fuel burn. I'm renting the aircraft, Wally. It's Bobby's fuel or UFS's fuel. It's not my fuel bill. I'm going to run it rich the whole time. And I told this young pilot that might be the mindset that you have as well as a student pilot. But what if we're 5 gallons short?
Yeah,
getting somewhere. So
right.
we just took her on her longest cross country yet, and we really flew where we would burn about 25 or 30 gallons. You need to start thinking, well, if I do that full rich and I burn 44 instead of the 30 that I think I'm burning based on my calculations, that could be a real problem.
Right.
Coming up short in an aircraft is never a good thing.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think you need to consider really using the fuel charts, using the calculations, knowing what you're running, what percentage of power you're running, so that you know your fuel burn. As we've talked many times in the past, those gauges are electric. What if you have an electrical failure? You better have a fuel log of some sort to be able to keep track and know where you were at at that point in your flight, so that you know whether you need to divert and get on the ground or not. Go ahead.
I have a 1980 model Piper Saratoga, Turbo Saratoga, and it's got a very nice engine analyzer. It tells me percent power. I mean, everything is on there. It's really nice, but it's amazing how much it matches the numbers in the POH. I can go in and say at this altitude, at this temperature, I should be getting a true airspeed of X and a fuel flow of Y, and I will go and look at the POH, and it's usually we're talking about 167 to 175 knots in that range, and it's usually within 1 or 2 knots. So people will, I've heard people say, well, this is a 30 or 40 year old airplane, and these numbers in the POH were when the airplane was brand new. Well, they were still really, really close.
Yeah, they were pretty smart back then, and their math was pretty good back then. I don't think those numbers would be too terribly far off. And as you consider your statement about the aircraft being older, the engine's not as old as the aircraft is, and that's where a lot of that performance is coming from, that engine and that prop. The airframe's probably the exact same it was on the day. Maybe the paint's faded a little bit. The one other thing I'll share that I think is super valuable to all students is the sample problems throughout the books. There's sample problem after sample problem throughout your POH that would make you a better, smarter pilot. You don't necessarily have to go to YouTube to learn how to do a weight and balance, how to calculate your cruise performance and all that stuff. It's in your POH, so don't hesitate to crack that open. And then those of you that are out there that do read them religiously, I'll applaud you, and I'll say I'm jealous of you. I can remember early in my training buying the POH, trying to read some of it, wanting to go fly. And another guy that I was training with said, oh, I read that already cover to cover and understand it and know it. And I always wondered why he was a better pilot than me. Well, I think I know why now, as I've gotten a little bit more mature in my aviation career. Knowledge is power, and it's no question that is if you understand the information in your POH, you're going to be a much better pilot as well. Anything to add, Wally?
No, I don't think so.
As always, now I guess we'll add, read your POH, fly safe, and stay behind the prop. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.